Hello, welcome back everyone to another episode of Graph Stuff FM, a podcast all about graphs and graph-related technologies. I am your host today, Jason Koo, and I'm joined by my fellow advocates, Andreas Colliger and Allison Cassette. Good morning, good day to you two.
Good
Hello,
to see you,
hello.
Jason.
And I'd like to extend a super warm welcome to our special guest today, who is a just well-beloved, awesome member of the graph community, Ashleigh Faith.
Oh, thank
Ashleigh,
you.
welcome.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Nice. Actually, I remember seeing some of your videos when I started at Neo4j a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
So you've been doing YouTube videos on knowledge graphs for, I want to say, just a little bit more than 4 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, that long. Doesn't feel like it, but yeah, that long.
Nice. So so I'm curious to know, what is your origin story? Like, what is the thing that got you into knowledge graphs?
Yeah, well, when I started into knowledge graphs, it was an accident. I think, as most people probably got into it, but I was working in academic search at the time. So at a publisher, they had a lot of content, and they had company stuff that they wanted to sell so that people could search for it. And I kept coming up against this issue because I was doing machine learning at the time, not LLMs. Machine learning, that tells you how it was a ways back. And I was working on auto classification and that kind of stuff. And I kept coming up against this problem where the users were using different words than what was on the metadata of the content. And I thought, there's got to be a way to tie these things together more. And at the time, knowledge graphs were not a thing that people really talked about. But I remember going to a conference, and the head scientist for, I think, human resources, David Meza, which is a longtime advocate of Neo4j. I was talking to him because I was in the same discipline as him in aerospace. And he's like, hey, have you thought about like a knowledge graph? And I'm like, a what? And then he said, yeah, this I said, can you spell that? I had no idea. So you all were actually the first ones I knew about. And so that's kind of where I started, where I was really looking at a way to tie together a lot of the natural language that humans were using with a lot of the structured data that we were getting from full text and the actual metadata on content. And it just spiraled from there in a good way, right? Because there's a lot of different applications for knowledge graphs that I came up against. I was in aerospace, so I got into a lot of cybersecurity and cyber physical systems. I was not that surprised when I also found knowledge graphs there that were being used. Got into some supply chain stuff because, again, vehicles generally was the content I was working on, are also using supply chain, and they showed up there. And so I started to get a lot of variety of knowledge graph exposure while I was, in that role. And I really found a passion for it because I just felt like this is one way that you can tie so much information together and find things in a way that I've never seen before. And so many people were either intimidated or didn't know about it. And I said, you know what? I want to learn more about this. So I went back, got my PhD, focused on this in advanced semantics, and started publishing and started eventually the YouTube channel because I wanted to help teach people more about this thing that I thought was really cool. And it seems like a lot of people like it because I have over 6,000 people that watch the channel a month now. So that's insane. When
That's
I think about
amazing.
it. I want to not think about it, or I won't make a video because then I'll be too scared.
And do you ever get a chance to meet some of your fans who watch your videos? I mean, besides us.
Oh my goodness. Calling them fans is also like, oh my goodness. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm so happy that I help people. Let's put it that way. It is the most rewarding thing. And my channel, the people that watch are so positive. They come and make like the nicest comments. People are saying, oh my goodness, this is the first video that made sense to me over all the textbooks and all these other things that I've seen. And I'm like, oh, thank you. I'm so happy that was helpful. And I started the channel in 2020. So I actually didn't get to meet a lot of people until recently. And so I will say I went to the Knowledge Graph conference this year, 2024. And it was my first in-person conference where I realized more people might know me than I know them because of the channel. And I thought, oh no, that's kind of surreal. And so I show up and I did the normal conference thing where I'm like, oh, hi, my name's Ashleigh. And they're like, I know. I'm like, oh.
I will say I was at the Knowledge Graph conference and I was going to bring it up when you said, oh, I don't know about fans. Let me tell you, definite fans. And to your point, like we were sitting at tables and I remember that moment when, you know, Ashleigh sat down and everybody was talking about how great your videos were. So your impact is not insignificant in the community. So
well, I'm glad that I'm making a positive difference out there. That's all I really hope for. And again, like the people, I think just in the knowledge graph space in general are just nice people for the most part. I mean, there's always like one or two that are like, oh my, but for the most part, people are really supportive and nice and lovely. And I will have to say that for most people that I've talked to that watch the channel too.
That's awesome. I have to ask a question then, like, as you mentioned it, that for, you know, your videos are amazing for people, like it makes sense to them suddenly as they watch your videos, you explain things so well. And so I've got, I guess, a two-part question. One, what do you think is behind the scary factor of knowledge graphs? Because people are intimidated, right? And then kind of on the flip side of that, like what's your go-to, hey, don't worry, let me explain it to you, kind of anecdote or metaphor, or like how do you explain it, you know, make it nice for them?
Yeah. I think it just goes back to most people are familiar with rows and columns. And when you start to show like these big hairball things, people are like, oh, that's a no. That's a no. I think it really scared. And I think that's one of my biggest like pieces of advice for folks that are trying to get stakeholders involved in knowledge graph is I think a lot of people like us were like, oh yeah, information, data, I can see all this really cool stuff. But that's not everyone. Right? And if you show that to stakeholders, they think, oh, that's going to be expensive. Oh no, how do I use this? And especially with the engineers that I've always, you know, known in my career, whether I work with them or, you know, consulting or whatever, it's I remember this story that encapsulates this so well. I was talking to an engineer about how we could use this to connect a lot of different data across different dispersed systems and how, you know, we could have one easy way to query across all of it. And, you know, we were talking about how to do that. And I remember him looking at me and saying, Ashleigh, what you're talking, because we were doing data transformation project at the same time. He said, Ashleigh, what you're talking about is like building this really cool and amazing balcony off of a shack on the beach where it's kind of falling apart. So like, cool, I get it, but like I got bigger problems right now. And you know, this person, I think because it's not, at the time at least, it wasn't commonly taught, it wasn't a pattern that was traditional to, you know, people that are used to SQL and you know, typical engineering patterns, that it was just like, okay, that's cool, but I got bigger problems and that is too much to learn. And how I help people get over that, I actually think, especially in this LLM space, while there's lots of other things we need to worry about and be cautious about, don't get me wrong, one of the nicest things about it is like, even with like, let's say GraphRag, again, there's lots of disclaimers on that. But it's helping break down the barriers. Like, oh, now I don't need to learn Cypher. I could just use the query language I'm used to. Oh, I don't need to worry as much about how to design this graph of things and how everything is connected together. I have assistants to help with that. There's so much more low code or no code ways to interact and build in the knowledge graph space now that it's not as scary. And I think it's just trying to meet people where they're at, where before it was like, oh no, now I got to find, you know, if you're on the ontology side, I got to go find somebody that knows how to do that. Or, you know, I need to find somebody who understands this graph thing and how that stuff works. And there's a whole new set of tools that I have to figure out. I think now that we are kind of getting away from that a little bit and we're kind of playing in the same space as everyone else is, it's become a whole lot less scary. So that's kind of the direction I go in now. I could tell you how I used to do it, but LLMs are here to stay. So I'm just going to keep with the new way.
The other thing I've noticed, Ashleigh, and I don't know if you've seen this too, I feel like folks who come from the data science and analytics background, I find have an easier onboarding to graph than from an engineering perspective, simply because, to us, it's just a different way of forming the data, right? It's another sort of data type in a way. And as the role of the data scientist has evolved and GraphRag has evolved, I was just curious, like what you're seeing as far as the interaction between developers and data scientists and graph, and what that environment is looking like from your perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember getting into my first analytical project. Like I was talking about search a little bit before, and tying different data and all that stuff together. But on the analytics side, I remember getting into the first project and going in Tableau, and there was no way to visualize a graph. And I was like, what? That sucks. Right. And then I had to go elsewhere. And hey, funny enough, I found Bloom. So, there's that issue. I think that's not as much of an issue because, again, graphs are a little bit more mainstream, a lot bit more mainstream now. So you don't encounter that issue. But I think what has helped is being able to actually crunch down what we're looking at so that the analysts can talk and the data scientists can talk to the engineers about, like, why are we doing this? And a really easy way to do it is, again, outside of the LLM space, which this is shameless plug for my Nodes conference talk. We're going to talk about how you can use Knowledge Graph, of course, to do fact verification. And that's like a huge reason people are getting into it now from an LLM perspective. But outside of that, if you have a query that does multi-hops, and it goes past like 3 hops, you can show clearly, okay, if I'm doing this query with my tables, here's a table, here's a table, here's a table, here's all these areas of translation between one table and another. When I'm doing my joins, that I could get it wrong. Maybe I don't know the right things. And you kind of like start to build that narrative, and then you show it in a graph and you get it within 1 hop. And it's like, oh, yeah. So I think that's how the analyst is helping the rest of their community, not just the engineer, is go, oh, I get it a little bit more now, right? So I think that's where it's helping translate between the groups, and it's helping. I think sometimes like the engineers, especially like data architects or enterprise architect, are like, I have this knowledge, and then the data scientists are like, and I have this knowledge. And it's, yes, you do. And you all should get along. And I feel like Graph helps with that. Now that, again, it's getting a little bit more mainstream. It's helping that translation and that transparency, right? Because I think sometimes what the analysts and the data scientists are doing kind of seemed like magic. And we all knew it wasn't magic. But now graphs actually help to make it more explainable. And then explainable queries, explainable algorithms, explainable AI, and then passing that on to your stakeholders and your engineers and whoever else. It's like, oh, I get it. Okay, great. Even if it's not the way that you do it in production, right? Like even just using the graph to explain what's happening in a visual way, because a lot of graph is visual, I think is really helpful.
So I love all that. And I love that particular aspect of like when you're talking about like an engineering mindset versus data science mindset. And it's the same data structure that you can look at as an analytical data structure, but you can also build an application with it. Yeah. And you can coexist. You don't have your own separate worlds. It can all kind of come together, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. That well, there's this misnomer. Like I remember when I first did the very first graph project that I did, and there was the debate: RDF or triple stores or property graph. Right. And this is this. I equate this to the same argument that was made, like R versus Python. It's like, look, you all have your camps, but they can coexist, and they are useful for different reasons, and sometimes they can do things together. Same with this, right? So I think that in the beginning it was, well, graph in general, not picking sides of anything, it's just too slow. It's too slow to do something at the edge, and it's too slow to, get that transactional data going through and all these other things. Like, especially, in the cybersecurity stuff I was working on, there was concerns that it wasn't going to be able to catch things in time. And I think that now, especially with a lot more compute power and of course, getting better knowledge around how to structure your queries, and, do you have to put the data at the edge, or can it be like a pre-processing thing? Like, there's all these other approaches, I think, that have come out that help you build better applications off of it. And I think that has gotten a lot more adoption too, because it used to be, that was another part of the scary thing. It's like, oh, like looking across a whole graph, that's going to take forever. It's like, yeah, or you could have a named graph, or you could have a persistent view, or like, there's lots of other ways to do it that decrease the scariness.
Ashleigh, so like in watching some of your videos, like you talk a lot about like kind of like the quality of bringing in data and kind of putting a lot of attention on that sort of start of the ETL process.
Yeah.
Do you have any like general tips for folks who are first, new to knowledge graphs and like, wanting to import data into a graph, right? Because it can be quite daunting for someone who's coming from like a very tabular space to go like, okay, how do I even get my data into a graph? Like, what would be kind of your top tips for someone getting started in this space?
Yeah. Well, I always say that you do need to start to make sure you know what a UID is. Like, I know that's not always something that you need to have, in a property graph, especially if you're just spinning it up for analytics and then flushing it afterwards. But, if you're going to do something where, let's just take, again, the LLM example. Your LLM is coming in, it has entities. It doesn't know if this is Michael Jordan or Michael B. Jordan, has no idea. Right. And so your graph needs to be able to identify the right entity. So entity resolution is a huge key. And a lot of that resides in, one, doing entity resolution as you're ETLing in or beforehand. If you have your data already in and you're transforming it into a graph, make sure you do that ETL, the transformation while you're loading it into a graph format to make sure those entities are resolved. And I remember one of the earliest examples of me working in graph where I didn't think to ask this question, which was, are these truly unique IDs? Because we were trying to do entity resolution amongst a lot of different databases of information on people. And these were like, people in the world, so not individuals. That didn't make any sense. So meaning you're people that are like celebrities, like people out in the world that have a persona that you can see and identify, rather than an individual that, their data is very private. You don't want to you don't want to mess around with inner database issues with that. So when we were doing this entity resolution to known people in the world, like a celebrity or somebody in the news, like a politician or something, we were bringing all of these IDs in, and we were just using them as they came in. And what we started to realize were those IDs were not unique. And so when we were doing the entity resolution, we were accidentally merging and deduping with wrong entities. And that screwed up so much of the system. It cost a lot of money to fix. And it was just because, we had assumed, we had asked the question, like, are these unique? And everyone's like, yep. I will say, please make sure, do a double check. that was a huge issue. But then there's also, the things that you're bringing in from tables. I think some people will say, well, I'll just have these entities, and the edges will be my maybe column names or something. But sometimes you don't realize those columns are multifaceted, right? And so then your data gets a little wonky because you think it's an address, but really it's the person's name, because maybe it was the mailing address instead of just a regular address, right? So you really, really need to check what you're putting into the system as you go. I think that's a big part of it. And also making sure that all of your stakeholders are in agreement on what things mean. Like the biggest debate known to man, what is a customer? How do you define it? How do you define it? How do I think of it? every single person will tell you a different answer. And so, if you ask nothing else, ask what does customer mean to you, to your stakeholders, and to their data, right? Because everyone's making their own data. So you need to make sure that, like, okay, we're all using the same. Maybe you don't need to agree on the same definition, but you need to agree what data represents the thing that you're trying to do in your graph. So I think those are the biggest ones. Anytime you have to deal with multiple graphs, that's the other one that has started to come up recently, because a lot of people are using graph now, and now you have to try to figure out, well, do you have a schema? What do you do with this data? How are you running your queries off of this? What do you do in these situations? Even something as simple as, what is an athlete? Is an athlete a role? Is it a type of person? I don't know, but you need to ask if you're looking at other people's data. And it's like that stuff, it causes so much debate, because you have to maybe reconfigure a lot of your ETL based on that, or your queries if you're going across multiple graphs at that point. So yeah, those are the big things that I would say are small questions that could lead to many, many headaches if not addressed.
You mentioned like data model. So like when I'm talking with folks, I'm pretty sure with the rest of us too, like when someone's asking like, how should I data model this? It's oftentimes we come back with a question like, well, tell us more about your namespace. So, kind of putting you on the spot. So like, is that the same for you, or do you have like this masterful like cheat sheet of like steps that you go through for kind of helping someone, decide how to create a data model?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, the thing that I will say, and I see this all the time on my channel too, where a lot of the examples that I use in the more how-to, like actually doing, like one of my top videos is how do you take these different data models, a taxonomy to a thesaurus to an ontology to a knowledge graph. Knowledge graph here being like instances, or more like a property graph kind of format. And it's one of the most popular videos because I literally go through the exact same data and how you change the data model for each of those. And I used an example in that example that I came up with from a lot of the experience that I have, because I'm familiar with it and I know how to model it. I always have people say, well, that's great, but I need it for my use case. I'm like, yes, but that's where you need like a consultant, or like to like sit down and figure it out. What do you need for your use case? And I know so many people get frustrated with that, because a lot of people struggle with how to do this part. Even with GraphRag, if you just let it go the way it is, don't get me wrong, it gives you great data, and I'm super happy it exists and we can use it. It's good clay on the table, but at the end of the day, it doesn't know your data. It doesn't know how you think about your data and how you need to answer the questions that you're asking. And so therefore you still need to model it and morph it a little bit to make it useful for your needs. I think that's where people struggle the most. So where would I start? I usually ask, what is the most important query that you have at your organization that you need to answer? Or what is the query that gives the most confidence in what your business is doing, or makes the most money for you, whatever it might be, your success metric? Because if you get that one query right and the data helps answer that, and you can show that it's being answered with higher quality, it's faster, it consults better data, whatever, again, metrics you're using to show your success, that's a good POC. It's going to get you more resources to do what you need to do on a longer term. And I've always found that if you can model that thing, it kind of touches a lot of parts of your organization, or a lot of parts of your data anyways. The other thing to keep in mind is sometimes you have to model wrong. And I know that maybe is a controversial statement, but here's the problem is, I have seen this so many times where you talk to stakeholders and they're like, well, this is how we're doing this, and this is how we think about it. And you look at that and say, I wouldn't have modeled it that way, or, oh, that's not correct. And I'm not saying just go with the flow. Like sometimes you do have to educate and try to make it more efficient and more accurate and all of those things. But at the end of the day, some companies define customer, for instance, in a really weird and funky way, or there's a very strange reason, like when there was a consolidation of businesses, like maybe you were acquired, there's a weird and funky thing you have to do to kind of get around some of the weird data structures that existed from the previous company. You have to be able to accommodate some of that strangeness. And that makes a lot of people who are doing data modeling uncomfortable. But again, if you try to recreate and fix the world, one, you will likely not get done. And two, the data isn't going to comply because it's already, got this long history of a different format or a different structure. And so then you're going to be fighting with that constantly. Or you go back and do a data transformation project, which also costs time, money, and energy. So, it's not me saying go with the flow and do something incorrect, but you do have to get a little comfortable with, let's say, creative ways of modeling things that maybe aren't textbook.
I have a question going back to GraphRag. So when you look at GraphRag, I think a lot of people at this point who have delved into it are comfortable with the concept of a graph and chunking. But when you look to the graph part of it, what do you find what would you recommend for someone who's newer? Does it make more sense for them to try and tie it to something structured, right? Or would you say, let's actually use like an LLM to extract different types of relationships from the text itself? So when you're adding on the graph part to GraphRag, I guess a long way of asking a question, when you're adding on the graph part to GraphRag, do you find that it's better to go with creating graph structure from the unstructured text or bringing in something structured?
I think it depends on where you are in your maturity, right? So if you already have a graph, I think it's a good way to identify areas that you might want to expand the graph, right? So you already have a graph, you can map things from GraphRag. A primary example is relations, right? The edges, to relations you already have. And it's like, great, okay, supporting evidence that this is a good way of modeling. We already have the data internally to support this. Now we have it from all this other stuff that we're bringing in. Great. But then you get suggestions, I think, from it where it's like, oh, I did not have that relation, but I can see the value of that. I can see why that would be helpful. So I think it's a good way to get suggested and expand the graph that you have to be even more specific or more nuanced in a certain area. But that's if you have something. If you are starting from scratch and you do not have anything at all, I still think that it's useful, especially since in the grand scheme, the person doing GraphRag is likely not the person who really understands deeply how your organization works, right? I mean, sometimes if you're super lucky, if you're a startup and you have a unicorn somewhere, but chances are you need a subject matter expert in legal or finance or product, whatever it is that you're working on. And so what I have found is helpful is doing more of a rough sketch of how the space that you're like, as an example, let's say that you're trying to help your legal department find, all of the data that you need to say that you are compliant in some regulation that's out there. Let's just say that as an example. That is something that you would want to sit down and say, okay, well, what kind of data do we already have? How do we, and making sure that the SME of that business use case is included, how do we think about this as an organization? How do we want to answer this question? Because if you don't do that part and you just do GraphRag and you have the data scientist or the knowledge graph engineer or whoever it might be, they are still working in a vacuum at that point if they're starting to use that and then develop something out of it when they don't understand how the actual business is going to use that information.
Yeah,
I see this as one of the biggest problems, by the way, in Graph is all of us are very excited about data. And I have a whole video on, great, I have a graph, now what? It's like, yeah, that's a problem. And don't get me wrong, I have been there so many times. It's like, I want to play and I want to see this and I want to see if I can model it this way and I can see what kind of questions, like, yay, exciting. But at the end of the day, you're doing this for a business. You're doing this for a startup or, helping humanity if you're doing something in environmental studies. Like, it doesn't, at the end of the day, you're building these things for a purpose, and you need to make sure that what you're building is fit for purpose. And therefore, even if you're using GraphRag to start everything, I think you still need to sit down and create not a model, but how your organization interprets that kind of information to answer the questions they're trying to answer with whatever you're supposed to be building.
Yeah, it reminds me so much of when the data scientist is told to go build a model that does X, and they don't actually know how it fits into the business, and knowing what that final application is going to change lots of decisions you make across that life cycle. So you make a really, really good point. And I love this idea of, again, tying the application builders, not just to the data scientists, but also to the business, and understanding what that really is, and making sure that you've got the right combination of people and the right clarity of a mental model in order to build something that makes, sense.
Well, and even more important, I think, than that is understanding where the data can't be wrong, or where it's very, very risky if the data was wrong.
Right.
Because a lot of the time, again, that data scientist maybe doesn't know that. And that is so critical to building, a model that can be trustworthy and that you can depend on. Because if you go in, and even if you have that mental model, but you don't know that, oh no, I didn't use the right column for customer. Oh no, that's doing this and this and this, and I didn't know about that. Especially anything that deals with people and their safety, and that would include like data privacy, I consider as part of safety. And anything that has to do with, and I mean, that would also be like supply chain, like the safety of people who have to depend on your product or your services or whatever it is you're doing. But also anything that has to do with regulations and law and legal things, you really want to be careful and make sure that you really understand all the ins and outs of what is super sensitive, what are things that you have to handle differently, who should have access to what. And then if you get something, if you get one of these pieces of data wrong, what are the implications of that? Because that helps, I think, the data scientist and the engineer, who is the knowledge graph engineer, understand where they really need to focus on something. And maybe you just need to sit, have a coffee, have a think on that topic in your graph, because it's so mission critical. And if you don't talk to stakeholders, you may have some inclination of that for sure. But again, you want to always verify when you're dealing with these kind of things.
And when you're pulling in stakeholders for this kind of a conversation, is it like a whiteboarding session, do you think? Or is it an interview, like, hey, just tell me your top 10 concerns? Or like, what's the approach there?
Yeah. So normally what I do is the first thing I just do a regular interview. I just sit down and ask like, okay, what are the implications of this? What does this thing do? The answers, why are these critical for us to answer now? Just the general, like, what is this thing and why are we doing it? But then after that, what I try to do is I identify where the data sources are. I try to figure out like what format they're in, and all of that stuff that you have to figure out to understand the level of effort for a project. But then once I like actually get into the project, that's where I do what's called a speak aloud, where and I have a video on my channel on this. I think it's talking to an aircraft pilot on how they go through their pre-flight check. And so I don't know anything about that, but I was trying to create an ontology on this because I was using RDF for this project. And they don't know that either, right? The expert that I was talking to, they have no idea. And so as they were talking, I was just using, I think it was like arrows.io or something like that. And just kind of showing, okay, here's how I would interpret what you just said. And they would look at it and say, no, it's like this kind of happens this way. And we were actually creating a data model based on time. Right. So we quickly moved out of RDF because back then RDF Star didn't exist and it was too cumbersome. So we did get into more of a time series model, and it was really rewarding. And I got to understand more about why does this happen before that? And like the why behind things, I think is so critical when you're building out a knowledge graph specifically, because if you put something in the wrong sequence, which is a common error when you ask an LLM to create the graph for you. It doesn't know like the sequencing of things all the time, especially if you're using your own, data to supply for the LLM to create a model off of. It doesn't get why things come before other things. That kind of stuff is, it comes out in the wash with this. And honestly, like, I think we're all data people here. People listening are probably all data people. Like, don't you hate when someone asks you to do something you have no idea why? It's so frustrating. And so therefore, it builds bridges. It gives you a relationship with the people that you're dealing with. It gives them a sense of trust that, like, okay, they're asking about what I feel about this thing. And they start to learn a little bit more about what you're doing. I did one of these recently, and the person I was talking to was like, good gracious, no wonder they pay people to do this. Like they thought it was so easy. They're like, oh, okay, you just, you just model it. It's fine. And then like when we got into it, they were giving me suggestions like, oh, well, maybe this way. And then I said, we can't, because if we did that, here's what the logic, we're actually telling the machine, the LLM in this case, from the model. And he's like, oh, I see. Yeah, no wonder people get like whole companies do like, yep, that's why. So it also gives them a sense of understanding as to sharing a story. One of my saddest parts of my early career, I was told by a boss of mine that was very ignorant about what this stuff is. Any monkey could do it. The exact words they told me. And I said, wow, that tells me a whole lot. And I did not stay at that place for very long. But that's a problem, right? And first of all, I don't think anyone should be saying that, period. But outside of that, like a lot of, back to that, like, well, it's kind of a mysterious box, like, oh, this stuff. I will also say, like, try as much as I used to want to show like the hairball and make it like, oh, look at all this great stuff. Show it in tables. Even if you're just showing these are your nodes and here are your relations and here, like, it's more familiar and you will get people dialoguing on it a lot more than if you show them the circles. Like, it's so strange, but I've seen a remarkable difference when I go away from the circles and the lines and just put it in like a more table structure. Like, even if it's just writing out all the triples, like, that's all it is, that's fine. But it like helps them see, oh, I see, this is how these things can connect. I think that's a big part of it too. So it's one of those things where I think a lot of people are still kind of struggling to get stakeholder buy-in. But if you can show them some of these, maybe shortcuts and, don't say this thing, which is sad, but like it helps. And also, like, just keep in mind, people are not always as excited about the data as you are.
How can that possibly be the case?
That's a hard truth. That hurts. It hurts.
Oh, it does, doesn't it? But it's, and I have to remind myself that all the time, because like, especially when I discover something unique and cool and interesting that the graph enabled, I'm like, oh, yay! And then like I show it to someone and they're like, I mean, cool. I mean, I'm glad we found that. Thank you. And it's like, it's really cool. That's why I love doing my channel though, because like I can geek out with people. That's why I like doing it.
Yeah.
I love it.
So speaking of your channel again, since you brought it up, so there's this thing I think you do every summer, which is like you kind of do like a round of like honest reviews of different technologies and services. I kind of have two questions from that. A, like, how do you decide what to? Let's start with this. Yeah, how do you decide which tools or which services to look at?
Yeah, so it is. I actually do it more often in December. Usually, it was kind of a play when I first started my channel. Not a lot of people watch YouTube or go on LinkedIn for that matter, where I post a lot of things around December. Of course, they're with their families, right? But there's like this fun thing that companies do. It's like, oh, a buyer's guide of holiday gifts. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I did that, but like for graph stuff? And so that's where this came from. It was really just a fun like play on that around the holiday season. And now it's like a holiday in July, Christmas in July kind of thing, where I do it in the summer too sometimes. And I try to do themes in the summertime. Like one year I did all like visualization tools. This year I'm doing all things that are really focused on unique aspects of graph. Like I just did one focused on just making sure that the security of your data is really strong, like stuff that is used for digital twins and by whole government organizations, and that's like their primary customer. And it's like, oh, that's okay. Like, I mean, we all focus on that to some degree in the graph space, but like that's like their primary thing that they work on. So yeah, I do these. I always like to preface, I've actually had people say, well, these are way too positive to be honest, that you must be getting, something for doing this. I get nothing, everyone, nothing. I do this because I find it fun and fascinating to see new tools. I get nothing from this at all. So what happens is I see people on LinkedIn or in the communities I talk to, like, Neo4j has like the ninjas, the people start talking about tools and different things that they've encountered. And I think to myself, I've never seen that one before. And I go in and I look at, I try not to influence myself too much by digging in too much, but I go to like the main page and I kind of see what they're all about. I kind of ask around like, hey, have you heard anything about them? And if it's positive, I'll reach out and I'll just find somebody on LinkedIn and I'll just describe it as, I am doing this honest review just so that people get I'll redo that so you can cut that out because my phone wasn't on silent. I ask people, this is meant to help my audience see what other tools are out there, because it's kind of a pain in the butt to reach out to salespeople, and sometimes they're not allowed, depending on the organization, to reach out. So all they have to go off of is like the company's own marketing materials, which we all know is going to make them look good. And so that's kind of why I do this too, is to give my honest opinion. I don't ever ask anyone to come on if I don't really like what they're doing. That's mostly because I like to keep my channel positive. But I don't ever hide anything that people aren't doing. I just highlight what they are doing. And so, if somebody's asking, well, what if they do they do this? And well, you have to ask them. There's a lot of use cases that I don't know about, so you have to ask those vendors about those things. But that's generally how I pick who's coming up. Is I start to see what's bubbling up in the industry, in the community, and more and more people are watching these. So people have started like reaching out and saying, can you do this one? Which is kind of cool. But that's generally how I pick who's coming up.
Nice. And that's a perfect segue into our next section of the podcast, which is our tools of the month. In, I don't know, the last couple months, Ashleigh, has there been one service, without, being, don't feel like you're being like highly endorsing this one thing,
No.
like one particular tool that really kind of stood out for you?
Yeah. So one that I've been kind of playing around with, and again, like I just started playing around with it, is Zentity. And that, again, because so much of your graph plus LLM journey is going to depend on entity resolution, I've been really starting to focus on that. See what's out there. I know Paco Nathan, who I think just did something with Neo4j on this topic. He's really passionate about this area. He's a lovely individual too, by the way. Like somebody that could be a jerk because he's so brilliant, but he is not. He's just like the nicest individual, which I love when I meet people like that could be a jerk, but because like they're so smart, but they're not, which is lovely. But yeah, entity resolution is a big deal. And so Zentity is one that I think either he pointed out or somebody else pointed out that they were playing around with. So now I'm playing around with it and seeing what can be had with that.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you. I guess we'll go around the table. ABK, did you have a tool of the month?
So for this month, Since this is the first day I've turned on my computer in about 3 weeks, I'm going to give a shout out to any airline that's still using Windows 3.1.
Yeah.
Love you. Love you. I've just traveled around a bunch and I've had no issues. I'm going to assume all those airlines are still using really old software. So sometimes the old ways are best.
It's not broke. Allison, do you have a tool of the month?
Mine actually isn't a tool. Mine is a program that uses Graph, and we've talked about them before. Adam Bly and the folks at System, they've recently expanded their the research areas that they cover to include climate change. So if you're not familiar with System, they're basically trying to graph the knowledge of the world and starting in certain areas. And one of the things that they do in System Pro is you can put in a query and it'll leverage the graph to not only do, graph rag of getting what you want, but it was probably actually the first application of graph rag, Ashleigh, right? Probably. We'll have to have him on and ask him about that. But what it does is it actually summarizes different pieces of the research itself and gives you a summary of, like, maybe you're trying to look up a particular scientific fact and it'll say, oh, we have the ranges are from here to here on this particular piece that you're looking for. And it will sort of group and summarize the different aspects of the research around whatever the topic that you're looking into. But I'm super excited that they've expanded into climate change because it's such an important topic. And especially for us being in AI, the carbon footprint of compute is something that I think we all need to be mindful about. And so I just wanted to, my tool of the month in this case is the topic of climate change and how we impact that, and also a way that you can start to research it. And always a big shout out to Adam Bly and the folks at System.
Nice. My tool of the month is kind of a shameless plug for Neo4j. It's so this month we had released the Cypher Copilot. So if you log into the dashboard, there's this little star icon on the right, and it's great for because like before I would have ChatGPT or Claude on the side and asking it Cypher related questions, but now you can just kind of ask directly within the dashboard, the browser tool. And there's a great write-up which I'll throw a link into, which kind of goes through all the strengths and weaknesses of the current version, right? Because the current version is using OpenAI and then giving some prompts, but it's not a fine-tuned model, right? So that has some some issues that come with it. And the article goes into lots of examples of this is where the Copilot is very good at, and then these are areas where the Copilot could definitely use some work. So, that was a great article. But yeah, in my own testing of it, certain things it just did really well. And then one thing I like to do in Cypher is check the schema of whatever graph I'm looking at. So this is called DB schema visualization, right? So I was trying to imagine being someone who didn't know what that call was and trying to describe how do I get this thing, this data model, this schema. And unfortunately, I couldn't get my Copilot when I was using it to give me that call, right? It got very close. It gave me call schema, which is not a function, but that it was in the right direction. So yeah, that's my tool of the month. And so, okay. So normally we would go into kind of a long list of events and, other articles that have come out in this last month. We will post that in the description of the links. But instead of kind of going through each one, I'd just like to go around the table again and just kind of, have everyone kind of mention what events that they're going to be going to soon. So if, people want to come out and, join us at a conference or at some sort of meetup, they'll kind of know where we're going this month. Ashleigh, did you want to go first?
Sure. So I think I have some smaller things that I'm going to be doing leading up to the Nodes conference, but I'm at the Nodes conference. And I'm going to be talking about trustworthiness, that you can use a graph to do fact verification for your LLMs. And then I also am going to be at Connected Data London, and I think I will physically maybe be there. So if anybody wants to meet me in person, I'm probably going to be there in person. So we'll see. It's pretty exciting.
Nice. ABK, I think you should go next since you are based in London.
And I'm hoping to go to Connected Data London, so maybe I'll see you there. That would be super cool. And before that, my next event this coming month, much smaller than Connected Data London, but I'll be at a meetup in London, honoring the glorious Taylor Swift. We're going to have a Swift-based Gen AI meetup. It's going to be fantastic. And to be honest, it's also an opportunity for me to learn about Taylor Swift. Apologies to the Swifties. I'm not actually a Swiftie, but there's something there. So I've got to learn about it. And this will be the occasion for me to learn about Taylor, and maybe for Taylor fans to learn about graphs.
Nice.
Allison?
The good news for me, and maybe not everybody else, is that I'm actually not going anywhere this month, which is a major event. Of the last 2 months, I think I've been gone like 6 out of 8 weeks or something crazy like that. So this month for me is going to be pretty quiet. Coming up in the fall, we'll be at the open source conference in Bangalore in October. I'll be at the AI conference in September. Obviously, Nodes is coming up. So lots of things on the forward horizon. So if anybody wants to catch up with me and has been meaning to connect with me via LinkedIn, now is an excellent time.
Nice. Just like Allison, I'm planning to be in San Diego for most of this month. I also just got back from a lot of traveling, so I'm hoping to reconnect with everyone that's here in Southern California. But also in September, I'll be joining some events up there. We're going to be doing another hack night with Weaviate. And then in October, I'll be, joining Allison for the event that we're doing out there. Why am I drawing a blank on it's not PyCon. It's
the open source. I think it's the open source data conference. It's an open source, the open source conference in Bangalore, October 23rd and 24th.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, we'll put a link to that. Cool. Yeah. And Nodes is happening in November virtually. And so all of us will be there, and looking forward to everyone who's listening, and hopefully you'll join us for Nodes when it comes around. Okay. So that is our episode today. Everything we talked about, we'll put links in the description, and we'll see everyone on the next one.
Thank you, Ashleigh.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Such a great special guest star. I feel like, we've reached a level in our podcast now. We're like, wait, Ashleigh came to spend time with us. We're so lucky.
Oh, no.
Thank you so much for all you do for the community. It was great spending time with you at the Knowledge Graph conference. And it's just really, it's lovely to get to spend some time with you and see inside the brain. I love it.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. I mean, I try. That's all I can say is I try.
All right. Well, you're very humble, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Big thanks.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you again.